We're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, mainly focusing in on child labor. So the pre-industrial period was a time kind of similar to the Industrial Revolution time, but a whole lot different. Citizens' responsibilities were mainly including their own land properties. 90% of Americans owned farms during the pre-industrial period, and so this highly affected the family life during this time period. People usually made their own clothing. They traded a lot between merchants and artisans, traded between artisans. So that's how they would make more money and be a little bit more efficient in having more items for people to choose from. And then family life was pretty close knit. The dad was the owner of a farm, which focused mostly in on um, giving his family opportunities to work on the farm with him, helping him raise cattle or cleaning up the areas. The Industrial Revolution actually started in Britain and European countries and was brought into America by a man named Samuel Slater. He grew up working in a textile industry in Britain, where he, by his mid-teens, kind of co-owned a textile industry with a couple men. And so once he reached this place where he just thought that his industry couldn't grow anymore and could be taken over by someone else, he brought in his own knowledge to the States through Rhode Island. Um, and he started his own yarn industry. And so he started this industry by hiring in families with farms. And so he would hire these families in and they would work for him. Um, whatever job responsibility it was, whether it was selling this yarn or making it, he put them to use. And this was actually kind of how child labor began in the United States, was from this man creating this industry. Family life changed quite a bit. Families no longer were super close knit in their work. Depending on what they did would depend on if they saw each other much during the day. And they had a lot more set hours, long hours of work throughout the days as well. There were two types of children within the Industrial Revolution. The first that I'm going to talk about are parish apprentice children. These children were orphans that were placed in orphanages that were usually run by a factory owner. Um, and what happened was these children were forced into working at that factory. So they were not paid. These children were paid through food, basic education, and housing. So they didn't get anything for their labor. A third of child laborers were apprentice children. They were orphans. Free labor children were children who lived with their parents, um, still poverty stricken, still not getting paid much, but they had to work. And so their parents had a huge role in where they went to work. So instead of the orphan, you had a child that had the choice of where they wanted to work. Um, Lawrence Reed states it like this. He says that these children were destitute and starving. Their only refuge was a factory. It saved them, in the strict sense of the term, from death by starvation. So these children were able to get their minds off of their poverty and um, kind of work themselves to death almost. Now we're going to look into some of the jobs and their responsibilities that the children had to do. First, we're going to look at street workers. These were kids that had to sell newspapers. They had to shine shoes, and some of them did some delivering messages to people in the cities. Their bosses were usually those in banks, offices, or factories. Um, of course, there was no telephone, internet, or any form of communication other than a paper or verbal speaking. And so that's what these kids did. Um, this is where the newsies came from. These were the kids that sold newspapers to businesses and collected the monies throughout the day. Um, it was definitely a competitive street business. These boys would play people very much. They would tell them that in order to go home, they had to sell their last paper. And a lot of people feeling sorry for them would buy their last paper, and the kids would go find more papers to sell. So definitely a competitive business. Then you had mine workers. These were the kids that were breaker boys, trappers, or helpers. Breaker boys were those who separated the slates of coal and rid them of the impurities. Um, they had the more dangerous job than either of the other two. You had trappers. Trappers sat behind a door all day, opened and shut it as the cars came in and out. And then helpers were boys who usually came with their fathers and helped them in whatever job responsibilities they needed help with. Then you had cotton mill workers. 25,000 children under the age of 12 worked in these cotton mills, and then a total of 50,000 children worked in this industry. Children were allowed to work as long as they could breathe, pretty much. 3-year-olds and up was the most common age that you saw within these factories. Their job responsibilities really were to help their moms. They were able to go with their mothers to work. This was the owner's way of creating a family-oriented business. Really, he wanted to make sure he had future employees. And so once these mothers passed away, the children would take over their spots, and then those children would have children. And it's a rippling effect, and that's how they kept their business in business. This is a list of few of the labor laws that were um, in act throughout this time period, none of which really helped situations, but they tried their best to. And so I think the most important one there is the 10-hour bill of 1847, which stated that women and children were not allowed to work past 10 hours a day. Most children would work about 10 to 16 hours a day without stopping, not even for a bathroom break. They weren't allowed to stop. So this was a positive effect of the revolution. Later on in the 1900s, they did form labor laws and somewhat eradicated child labor. It's still in effect today, but they did their best to do something with it and better it.